In the last episode of Inner Work Essentials, I held up this heavy stack of integral theory and integral psychology in an attempt to visualize the depth and breadth of Ken Wilber's genius and his scholarly, incredible philosophical contributions to the mapping of human consciousness and the development of our consciousness over time. That was what we did in the last episode. In the last episode, we started with brief history of everything, and then we kind of drawed upon integral psychology, and we looked at integral meditation kind of a little bit, and I hinted towards Religion of Tomorrow being the top 4 books to read in that order. But today, we're going to get very precise. We're going to look at what it means to be at a level of consciousness. Let me put these books down and I'll explain. So in the last episode, I introduced the visualization that although we're conventionally used to looking at consciousness almost in a ladder-like way, like a rung that we climb up, we go from the magic to the mythic to the modern to the postmodern, and we're reaching towards the integral now, and eventually the super integral. That works conceptually. You can also do a visual metaphor of a spiral. This is the spiral dynamics version of that same metaphor, or the holonic series of spheres. This is the idea that the modern, for example, is the foundational underpinning of the postmodern. The postmodern is a sphere built on that modern sphere, built on the magic, built on the mythic, built on the archaic. But what does it mean to be at a level? What does it mean to have a level of intelligence or consciousness at any sphere, any point of the spiral, or any rung of the ladder? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to approach it by talking about IQ, EQ, and VQ. What is VQ? Well, we don't really talk about it too much, but I'm going to introduce a curveball of a book, which isn't actually Wilber. It's Integral Consciousness by Steve McIntosh. What McIntosh is doing in this book is essentially summarizing and expanding upon Wilber's work. So the quote that I'm going to read from you is from this book, but it's actually from Wilber. And he's talking about how developmentalists, different cognitive developmentalists, or maybe child psychologists, are often a little bit wrong in their charting of consciousness because they're not looking broadly enough. They're looking in a flat way like this, not a holistic, spherical sense. So let me explain with this quote from Steve McIntosh, who's quoting Ken Wilber. Quote, "After 4 decades of pioneering research, we can put all their results onto the table and have a look, and an unmistakable pattern emerges." This is the important part. There is not one line of development that the dozens of models are giving different maps of. Rather, there are at least a dozen different developmental lines: cognitive, moral, interpersonal, emotional, psychosexual, kinesthetic, self, values, needs, and so on. Each of the great developmentalists tended to stumble upon a particular developmental line and then explore it in great detail. And then we've got this wonderful illustration to capture exactly what Wilber's going towards. You can see that he's talking about, turn it this way, the different levels of the different streams: IQ, EQ, and VQ. I'm not even going to talk about IQ and EQ. You already know what they are. It's not a very interesting video to make. But VQ, values intelligence, moral intelligence, that's the key to getting to a different stage of consciousness via the integral theory perspective. So what does it mean to develop your morals? What does it mean to develop your values in that real sense? Well, it actually means the difference between one stage and another stage. The example that Ken Wilber uses is the Nazi doctor. Well, you think, well, he's not a very likable chap. In fact, there's a lot of evil in there. And yet he's very smart. And in fact, he might be very emotionally smart too, especially if empathetically he could extend into a victim or a subject in a concentration camp to know the kinds of psychological impact that he's going to exert on them in that torturous way. Morally, he's at the level of archaic consciousness, magic consciousness, who knows? We have to turn back to Abraham Maslow from episode 21, I think, to know what values we're really aiming towards. This is a lot of books I'm trying to synthesize in one video, and it will all make sense in a moment. I'm again trying to synthesize and present a lot of information in just 52 episodes, and each episode itself is just 15 or 20 minutes, so it's a little bit messy at the start, but bear with me, we will make it practical. What does it mean to develop our moral capacity? Well, it means the difference between one stage and another stage, and I would argue that you should even visualize your moral development, your value development, as the central pillar of which your other developmental lines are like ivy. It's like the tree trunk, and the ivy of intelligence is red. The ivy of emotional intelligence is blue. Your creative capacity is like yellow. They're all wrapping around that moral tree trunk. What are the morals that we're aiming towards? What's the deeper roots that we should pay more attention to? If you've watched a previous episode, you'll know Maslow's being values. These are his 14 values of self-actualizers, the typical traits that self-actualizers tend to constellate around. And I read them 3 times in a previous video. I'm going to read them one more time now, and hopefully they'll land even deeper. The 14 high values of self-actualizers from Maslow toward a psychology of being: wholeness, perfection, completion, justice, aliveness, richness, simplicity, beauty, goodness, uniqueness, effortlessness, playfulness, truth, and self-sufficiency. If you got a little flashback to a few episodes ago, you know the feelings that I'm talking about. They truly are the integral values that we're trying to aim towards. This is roughly as much theory as I want to introduce without getting it too complex. Again, I recommend, if you want to learn more about integral theory as a whole, go for integral consciousness. If you want to go into Ken Wilber's work, then read these 4 books in this order, and that's basically all you need to do. For the sake of an immediate, practical, applicable version of this multiple intelligences theory, a way of going from one level of consciousness to another, don't focus on your cognitive or emotional capacity alone. Yes, develop those streams, develop those lines, build each of those wonderful weaving ivies, but the real test of achieving a new level of consciousness from the integral theory model is how, well, I suppose it's twofold structure. It's which values do you orient yourself around, part A, and part B, to what degree have you got a sense of conviction or embodiment of those values? To what degree are those values in your conscious mind and in your conscious behavior, rather than unconscious territory or projected territory, which actually creates a sense of incongruence or inauthentic fantasy image? You can see that my energy is already opened up now that I have left the theory dumping stage behind, because this is real. This is a living way to get yourself to that next level, to expand yourself to that next sphere, to take that next turn on the spiral. Which values do you live by, and to what degree do you honestly, authentically constellate around those values and concretize them into your being? I'll give a few examples. Say, for example, you are a very artistically gifted individual. You truly value and repeatedly enact the value of beauty, aesthetic beauty, wonderment with the world. You paint, you draw, you write music, all in a way of mutual relating, mutual interplay between yourself and that value of beauty which represents in the world. And you have that dynamic exchange. That's wonderful. And you can have that as your highest, most guiding value. You could also have something like self-sufficiency or truth or any of the other being values of Maslow kind of wrapped up there. What would it mean for you to live by those values 50% of the time and to not choose to spend time living in a value like, I don't know, rapacious materialism, that idea of taking, that idea of hoarding, that idea of maybe producing an artwork but with the intention of selling it for a lot of money at an inflated price, not for the sense of beauty, but for the sense of material capital gain. And this is where it gets unconscious, because perhaps you want to use that capital gain to go and use it for self-destructive purposes. Perhaps you actually want to use that money to drink, drug, and fuck yourself silly and hurt yourself and the people around you. Strange example perhaps, but it's actually maybe not too strange for the kind of person who'd watch this, because it's a microcosmic specific of something which is a wider pattern, which is on the surface we might be aiming towards a beautiful, high, integral value. We might appear to be morally advancing in one way or another, but if we take in that energy and then something happens inside of us, maybe due to trauma or some kind of fragmentation or an archetypal possession or something which disconnects us from that original moral quality, and then we turn that or pour it in some direction which then is counter-moral or amoral, not to even necessarily say it's right or wrong, not for me to decide, but it's definitely counter to that value because you have a beauty and a wonder and a tastefulness. And if you went to drug addiction and sex addiction, it's a tastelessness, it's a superficiality, it's blind consumption. It's not breathing in the wonder of the tree or the beautiful model who you're painting. It's completely different. That's the true test of consciousness via this interpretation of lines of development. Again, I've only really mentioned one here, values and morality being that core line, but you could say to some degree, what would it mean for someone to have 150 IQ, to be a default empath with low-grade psychic abilities, to have kinesthetic intelligence where they're a semi-professional dancer and also a professional skier, to have a level of artistic talent where they can actually write very beautiful symphonies, and yet they're still addicted to some kind of unconscious shadow pattern, or maybe they're manipulative with their partners romantically or their colleagues in a business sense. How do we decide? And this is the impossible question. How do we decide where someone's level of consciousness is? We can't truly with the rational perspective. You can feel it with your heart. You can feel it from more of an intuitive knowing if someone is at your level. It's a really strange thing to even talk about because it's not popular in a mainstream perspective to actually hierarchically rank people based on consciousness. It almost stinks of something racist or colonialist or something which is so left in the past. And yet we know there's a difference. We know there's a difference from someone who spends 60% of his energy drinking and drugging and someone who spends 60% of her energy creating and beautifying and reveling. It's not even about class, it's not about gender. One could be very rich, that drinking, drugging guy could be a CEO, billionaire. And that genuinely beautiful being who just wants to paint could be broke. She could be from a very lower class background. Who's at the higher level of consciousness? I'm not going to say. We can't capture such a level of internal complexity in an outer presentation, let alone me in one video attempting to do that as if I were the judge of consciousness and all those around me. It's a fool's game. But hopefully it reflects to you that there's a deeper question to be asked. There's a deeper question when it comes to development and healing. And that is, again, which values do you live by? Which morals do you orient yourself around? And if you were to take a step back and honestly assess, to what degree do I actually embody these values? To what degree am I truly a representation of that energy, any particular high value, any particular high energy, as me? To what degree is that my essence? Because it does change. And I know because you can have, maybe you went through this stage, you can be a very bratty, very sullen, very negative teenager, for example, and still grow into a beautiful, life-affirmative, generally loving adult. What happens in between? Your values change. I'll leave it there. In the next episode, we're going to be going even deeper into transpersonal psychology. We're going to be weaving in integral psychology, humanistic psychology, into that transpersonal, otherworldly sense with Dark Night, Early Dawn by Christopher Back. arguably one of the best transpersonal psychologists out there. I'm not going to say too much about it. I'm going to let your curiosity guide you to this click. I'll see you over there.